I'm Simon Goodwin. I was the technical editor of Crash magazine and worked for Quicksilver and Geek and people like that in the old days. And still working on games now, strangely working for these people. And oddly enough, my Uber boss is Rod Cousins, who was kind of in charge of answering the telephone without giggling at Quicksilver in the early 1980s. This particular talk is about the Spectrum hardware, and the main purpose of it is to answer your questions. So we're not going to be going through a soldering 101 or anything along those lines, but we have got people who should be able to answer questions on both the mechanical and the electronic aspects of the Spectrum. I hope I'm not stitching you up here. We've got Rick Dickinson, who is responsible for the industrial design. Exactly. So, guess keyboard-related questions might possibly move in that direction, amongst many others, and I guess there'll be some cost-related answers as well in there. Also, we have Chris Smith. Now, Chris Smith has written the ultimate electronic geek book, I would say, which was a description in probably more detail than was available at the time, I suspect, of the inner workings of the Spectrum custom chip, the ULA, that made it possible for us to have a £125 computer in 1982. And so he can explain all sorts of things like why there are very slight shadows down the side of flashing characters. He knows the transistors intimately. So, I shall start off by asking if anybody has been saving for the last 30 years a question about the Spectrum, and we'll start with you, please.
Why are there little shadows down the side?
That was you, Chris.
I had a small argument with Richard Atlas over dinner about this. He denied that this is at all possible to occur, and I quickly went on the internet and showed him that, look, it's a screenshot, it's actually happening. The reason that there are shadows down the side of flashing characters, and in fact you can also see slight intensity differences if you alternate a 010101 pixel pattern and then invert that, but also invert the colours, and you see them as being two slightly different shades. The reason for it is that there's a part of the circuit which basically switches between one colour selector to another colour selector. And the switching signal takes two different paths, and one path is slightly longer. So when it switches from a foreground colour to a background colour, you end up with that occurring much faster than if you switch between the background colour and the foreground colour. So you end up with a very, of course, televisions in those days were analog. You won't see this on LCD TV probably. With the analog electron beam scanning across the screen, that slight delay means that you get you encroach slightly into the pixel before the signal changes. So you get like just a bit of an echo. So it hasn't quite converted when the electron beam into the next pixel. So that's why you see those little shadows.
Yes. There's only 64 microseconds. Well, roughly. It's only meant to be 64 microseconds between successive scans of the display. And so even the delay associated with signal going through one extra transistor can be enough to cause a very small
difference.
It's
only 15 or 20 nanoseconds, and given the bandwidth of the video signal, which is why Richard and I were kind of like couldn't really see eye to eye on why it actually happened, was that and actually all all of my electronics theory background tells me that the video bandwidth available isn't sufficient to make that noticeable, but everybody who's seen it.
Is that why you look at the colours per square?
No, the limited colours per square is due to, well, what Richard did was took inspiration from the sort of teletext standards that were available at the time. And said, well, look, if we make it more colours per square, then what he wanted to do was just have pixel on as one colour, pixel dot as another colour, given 1 byte was 8 pixels, that basically meant that in a single line of 8 pixels, you only have 2 colours. But he could have increased the vertical resolution quite easily, but that would have meant 24, 27K of memory was consumed instead of just under 7. So he used the sort of text standards to say basically a character square would be 1 or 2 colours, foreground, background, and let them change those independently. So that was all about cost.
Well, the other one is a big issue when it comes to the resolution, both in terms of pixels and colour, is the fact that regardless of whether or not it's changed, the computer has got to keep reading from memory the information in order to reconstitute the display. What that means is that the more pixels you have on the screen and the more colours you have and the more control you have over the colours, the less time there is for the processor to actually do any work. And the consequence of that was that this original, here we go, 16K version of the Spectrum, including the dead cockroach, which maybe we can talk about later as well. This one, the 16K Spectrum, was 25% slower at running programs than one running code from the extra memory in the 48K machine, because these memory chips down here were spending about a third of their time providing information for the video, during which time the processor just had to wait. So, that's enough electronics here. Have we got any kind of production engineering, manufacturing kind of questions, please? Yes, please.
So, if the machine sold for 125 or 16K,
yep.
what was the cost of the materials for production?
I hope Rick knows.
Good question. What we often used to do was think of an idea of product and then imagine what somebody might pay for that. We didn't do this all the time. We probably didn't do the Spectrum, but by then there was a clear pattern, which was, is this a retail product we go to shop, or is it going to be, say, like the ZX80 or the MK14 before that, which were just designed as kits for the hobbyist market? And as such, if it was for the hobbyist market, what we call a direct sell, which means a large chunk of the overhead, if you like, which would be the retailer, is taken out of the equation, which means you can either make more profit or sell it for less money. So things like Spectrum, for example, are really a follow-on from the ZX81 in a marketing sense of this is going to be supplied to shops like W. Smith or whoever, rather than just a direct sell off a magazine advertisement. So you had to take account of, remember, what would you pay for that? Just think of a number. So you've got to take off that VAT. I know it's supposed to be designed, it sounds really boring, but you've got to take off VAT. Then I learned subsequently that the margin that the retailer will expect, which will be vast, okay, it could be 50%. And then what's left, the distributor has to take something. And then what's left of that, which will probably be about a fifth of what you pay for it, is a small pot of money that's got to pay lots of staff, lots of tooling over a period of years, and then actually buy the bits, assemble it, test it, and kick it out of the factory. So that may go somewhere to answer your question in terms of just the overall picture and how things get broken up as a sort of order of magnitude, if you like. So it could be anything. You buy a toothbrush, in Boots, electric toothbrush, I should think. I don't know what you pay for that. £35 of this posh one maybe. It is coming out of the factory at £5 or £6. So then remember, there's a lot of overhead in the factory. So the materials are going to be staggeringly small.
What percentage returns did you get? What percentage didn't work of those you were turning out of the factory?
Two different questions there. Yeah. Because a lot of the returns came from catalogue companies that had a no quibble guarantee. And so anybody whose cassette recorder had fallen down the stairs too many times might well blame that on the Spectrum. But maybe Rick's got another I have too.
Yeah, very good point. There was this, I think Sinclair always had a no-quibble thing, even going back to the calculator days. And so if people were, let's just say, dissatisfied or not interested in it for whatever reason, even some pathetic label reason, they had the option to send it back. So it doesn't necessarily mean you've got a failed product, the product doesn't work in some way. But returns for what I would call genuine reasons were staggeringly high at different times, depending on what was going on. Some stuff was rushed out. We were just almost falling over laughing, looking at the mark on the board. I mean, I got involved with track layout for the ZX80, for example, and this really was get girlfriends in the weekend and help us lay out the tape, a little crash course on laying out the tape, and off you went.
It's pretty much done by hand.
I'd say the ZX80 was better than that. So, but that's also part of the excitement. But there's a terrific amount of risk in all of this. Every level is risk, and I think with Clive, it was just keep pushing, just keep pushing. It's almost like being in a war and fighting for your life. Just keep going. You're not there yet. But as I say, the rejects was astonishing. And, there's a lot of bad press. So a lot of the company resourcing, if you like, was diverted to dealing with that. And when we got companies like Timex have done deal on board eventually, then that improved the resourcing. But it was a problem. There were often sort of heart-stopping realisations that were coming by telephone by 16-year-olds saying, "How did you know?" Christ, he's right.
What sort of thing? What would the 16-year-old be telling you?
I remember a vague one, a very early one, was the floating point arithmetic problem. I can't remember exactly what it was. It put in a certain bunch of numbers, the whole thing really fried up. Probably twist.
Yeah.
We had to send out. Luckily, I think in the early days we used EEPROMs, but obvious reasons we thought things were going to go wrong and get flexibility.
Yeah, no, it's the operating system in here as a socket.
So we'd send out EEPROMs and instructions on how to take the case apart. And it's a bit like buying a car and, if something head blows up, there's a new one in the post. You've got this spanner, then off you go. It's standard. But maybe it was mildly acceptable because we come from selling kits. And the whole thing about the Sinclair computer thing really was how it went and how it ended up, so to speak, was not what was planned. That's the an important thing to remember. It was, I think it's a obvious market. What's the market? 10,000 a year, maybe. And we're selling in kit form, and that was the start of it. But the fact that what happened absolutely wasn't planned. It was not part of the marketing. And for a long time, there was a terrific resistance to what you guys do. It was hugely resisted. It was coffee cup flying in the air, fist slamming stuff. This is not a games machine. Not my view, but that's Mr. Sinclair's view. He had this clear vision, clear enough of this actually what helped guys like you. I want people to understand about computers. And at the day, people didn't even know what a computer was. So, for example, the ZX80, which my predecessor, John Pemberton, was enough for that. But he left to go elsewhere and left me putting it into production straight out of university. How do you do this? And so there I was with these plastic case parts. I was in a factory that specialised and made lampshades that were selling in places like Woolworths. Because the technology was the same. And you think, crikey, a lampshade. And now and again there'd be a problem. Clive would get onto the phone to the factory. He said, "Look, Mr. Swallow, this is a bloody computer we're making. What a damn lampshade." So you had all these weird things going on at the time.
Yes, question, please.
That's it, thank you. I think lots of people ask technical questions, but I want to ask an aesthetic one. 30 years later, the Spectrum is iconic, and it's something you see in a montage of 80s stuff in a way that lots of other computers at the time you perhaps wouldn't see in that montage. I want to ask you a question, in kind of two-part. That is one, well done. Yes, I want to ask you first, is that as you were designing it, how important or how much consideration did you put on making it look cool, considering it's a functional thing, making it look cool? And secondly, if you accept, which I think that it is cool, what do you think as a designer makes it cool?
Yeah, I'll try and go back into where my head was then. And frankly, I find designing any product really difficult, and particularly so it's the Sinclair stuff generally, because in most cases with the Sinclair stuff, certainly in the early days, and Spectrum is in that pot, there were no real references. I know you had other kinds of computers from the US and what have you, but just off, So one of the questions was, well, how will it be? You know, what should it look like? Because, you know, a really important design philosophy is that whatever the form ends up being, generally, it follows some sort of functionality. There will be things that fundamentally drive its function. So, you know, steam train, which you could argue is a beautiful thing, there's no aesthetics gone into that other than elegant engineering, but it's a fantastic looking, sounding, smelling thing, isn't it? So the same applies to any product, really. And so there was always this difficulty, what should it look like? You know, is it a piece of office equipment? I'll make it look like that. Is it a piece of kitchen equipment? Well, obviously not. You know, the home office hadn't been invented. Is it a piece of hi-fi? No. So there's no sort of, and you know, there's a strong language, a subliminal language in aesthetics that happens to you, and you'll be attracted to something or turned away by it, purely by this sort of subliminal language that's coming from its form. So it's really important to get that placement right, but if you don't know where this damn thing's going to sit and what it's going to be, you haven't really got much to go on, so you sort of blunder along with ideas and really fall back onto the form follows function bit. So a really difficult bit is just sorting out the keys. You know, there's up to 7 bits of information on a key. Well, a key generally has one surface. You've got a surface at the front, 2 at the side, 1 at the back. You can't see them, so you can't put stuff on it. You can put stuff around the keys, but then it might start looking as though it's part of the next key. So, you know, there's really huge getting information over kind of problems that relate to physical aspects. So once you get that sorted, and you want it to be as small as possible, because everything Sinclair is as small as possible, you then start looking at the engineering, which is everything's got to be as cheap as possible. You know, so on a normal keyboard, there's probably at the time about 5 to 10 moving parts on a single key. So that's a lot if you then have, you know, 48 keys or however many you've got. And so you start thinking of, we need a different technology. It doesn't exist. So the rubber key mat, we had this conversation earlier, is made by a company that produces condoms. You know, the metal surround is made by a company that produces cookie darts, because they weren't making bezels, they were just cookie darts, but they had aluminium, they could cut it, they could shape it very accurately, and they could print as many colours on as you like. So I thought, okay, there we go. So you're going to all these wacky places. Now, the reason I mention that is, all that then feeds back into, now what can I do with these limitations? You know, because as I say, it's function driven. The PCB can be any shape. You've got things that come from the outside, like the connectors. Well, that's really important. Where do I want the connectors to be? You know, you want the left, the right, the front, the back. So eventually you make a decision which feels logical. Let's get all the wires out of the back. And then, you know, for example, at the time, the Japanese were doing fantastic products. They were quite innovative, but they hadn't got that bit right, and they're starting to get it right now. Is that you've got 6 sides fundamentally on a product, and they would put controls on every single side, because that's just where a switch or a connector happened to be, because the PCB layout guy put it there. That suits his requirements, yes, but it doesn't suit the user's requirements, and therefore I'm interested in the user. You guys, how's your life going to be living with this product? The PCB guy will put stuff just everywhere where you don't want it as a user, so you've got to be involved with them. So the layout is a very closely interrelated, linked in a sort of push-pull thing. Now, again, I'm mentioning all this because this is sort of insight perhaps into some of the boring stuff that goes into the things that stop you doing what you might want to do. So you could go on a desert island and think, right, okay, it's going to look like that, that's fantastic. Then you come to actually do it for real and you realise it can't be like that at all, because there's a trillion things you haven't thought about that actually are going to completely change all that. So then comes the question of, cool, I think it's really hard to judge your own work, I'm sure anyone can design stuff like this. So you by luck, Sinclair had a kind of house brand anyhow, going back to the calculator days, and it was what I would call Bauhaus minimalist approach. So you have a lot of companies, you have American companies that tend to be quite brash. If you look at their cars, you look at European cars, you get the picture. And then you have Braun, I think the industrial designer, Dieter Arms, he was very minimal. You know, what is the least we can give, to make the a sort of less is more sort of thing, rather than embellishing and complicating. So a minimalist approach was driven, reduction of minimum cost. So it doesn't really leave you with much. And I mean, I could have just said I don't know actually. But eventually you start wrestling with all these different variables and a shape starts to come out of it. So the materials start to come out of it. The rubber keyboard came out early. It was darn ugly on its own. It needed something to cover all the gaps between the keys. A plastic moulding would be too thick. Thin metal. Metal is thin. Okay, that looks nice. So now you've got metal, plastics, rubber. You've got 3 different materials, 3 different manufacturing processes, 3 different ways of applying colour and texture and all the rest of it. So you've then got to start pushing all this together. And I guess somehow shape sort of comes out of it. And then I always made models. Clive was seriously into model making. Not that he did himself, but the previous designers had always made models. What do you think of this as a shape? Yeah, that's great on there, whatever. Then you start putting in more and more detail, so you're building on this picture. And I guess eventually you come up with what you think is a fairly finished model, and then you go through a production engineering phase. But I think the only thing driving it, going back to your question, is I just want it to look right, rather than through all this or that. And part of that is trying to figure out, well, who's going to be the judge of that? Who is the market? Is it 15-year-olds? Is it retired people?
You mentioned reference points, and you said it's a business, it's a hi-fi. No point you say is it a toy. Correct. And you see, and the fact that it's small, it's got that really nice young thing. Did that not go through your head? It looks, and this is in a good way, it looks a bit like a toy.
Sure, yeah, and it does. It did. It's things we talked about, and also they were frequently, I won't call them criticisms, they were frequently observations. And it's quite difficult to stop something look like a toy because once you make it smaller, but one way around that is if you've fundamentally got a small product, because that's how it needs to be, or that's how it is best. There are ways of doing that. So, for example, a watch is very small, but they go into a different level, a lower level of miniaturization and detail, so that your eyes drawn into a watch and you're starting to see things that are 0.1 of a millimetre. If you're looking at a car, you're seeing things that are probably 5 millimetres. So you downscale the amount of detail you've got to go to, but then the trouble with that is you then start running into much more elaborate, expensive manufacturing methods and more expensive piece part costs. So I think it's always a balance. But yes, never thought of it as a toy.
Okay, we've got a couple of questions here. One there, and then I'll come to you if that's all right.
I was just going to comment on this.
Oh, okay, fair enough.
To me, the aesthetic there is of the calculator, but wider. Almost like that's an in-between step between having, from the end on, the calculator.
I guess there's a question there
So
because
it's midway between that and the...
Sinclair made a lot of calculators.
Yeah.
To what extent was the calculator design an influence on this?
Well, again, if you think of a calculator, what have you got? You've got a display and keys.
Yeah.
All we've taken away here is we've added more keys and we haven't got the display on the product. So
It's the block at the top for everything.
yeah. And again, going back to PCBs, you've got a lot of control over the actual, once the general area is known. And there's a limit how much you can push it around to it, but you can push the PCB around to suit the shape. So for example, the keyboard, we didn't want the product to be any wider than the keyboard. You can't come forward of the keyboard because that would get in the way. You don't want to be thick, so you could have a multi-layer effect because that just makes it too high and uncomfortable. So the only way you can go is really simple. It's process elimination. You can only go back. So there's no kind of magic. It's just common sense. Actually, John Pemberton said to me when he left me production I was in his early 80s, he said, don't worry about it. He said, it's just all common sense, and the bits you don't know just muddle through until you do know. Quite good. But, question, please.
Yeah, sorry, you saw my question and then you
Oh,
No, so one bit's going on to that to hopefully round up the aesthetic side of it. I think Sinclair products generally is the closest the UK's got to an Apple kind of design aesthetic. in terms of computing. It's fantastic. How much of the design and the aesthetics what come from Sinclair? How much of a part did you play in that? Because it's gone throughout his products since they began.
Yeah.
How much of a part did he play in it, and what sort of part? Was it dictatorial, or was it taking your advice?
Yeah, he was an absolute central nerve to every aspect you could possibly imagine, even the screws that he has to go. He knew, again, this is, you're sort of mildly disappointed when you see things like the C5 there, because that's the popular memory of Sinclair, and that's the least important thing in my view that he's ever done. And usually the people that think about the C5 don't think about the really significantly important things, like the creation of the pocket calculator that didn't exist, the electronic wristwatch, the stuff, the reasons why we're here today. And sorry, I've just lost your question for a second.
Is it just how much of a part did you
Oh yes, sorry, thank you. Yeah. And so yeah, what drove me to that little ramble was Clive. For me so far uniquely, I'm sure there are other people like this, he knew so much about so much, whereas so many people know a lot about a little or a little about a lot sort of thing. He knew a staggering amount, or enough, let's say, to know how much you could push every aspect that went into a product. And there's so many aspects that go into a product. Like, does anyone ever stop and think for a moment, the whole marketing and getting it to the marketplace, how the retailer's going to deal with it. There's just dozens and dozens of things to think about that normally require companies. There are hundreds of people in this company, and they've been doing it for 30 or 40 years, and they've evolved. So, yes, he was, he's probably dictatorial, but I think for the right reasons. Because he had the singular vision. I don't want to sound melodramatic, but that's, he had a vision each time. He knew where he wanted to be, and he knew enough about all the things he needed to push in that direction together to arrive at that point. And just in what I do, for example, I work on all sorts of different products, and you need someone with a vision, because all the other parties don't share your common vision. They only know their bit, okay? And there's nothing wrong with that. You want people to be good at their bit, but somewhere, someone's got to bring all those bits together in the right direction. And that's what he did so well. And in order to do that, you've got to stick your nose into every little, mucky corner and say, look, this has got to be like that, or it's got to be like that. And, so yeah, he was absolutely, knew everything that was going on. And that was essential. Otherwise, again, we wouldn't be here today talking about it.
Thanks, Rick. Hopefully somebody's saving up a few hardware-related questions, but we'll go next to the chap with the goatee who was waiting to me earlier.
I'm sorry, it's not a hardware question.
That's all right.
It's another aesthetics question, but I've always wanted to know, what was with the fake heat sink vents on the ZX80?
Oh, yes!
Well, I didn't do those, but I can attempt to answer it. I think it can be better with them than without them. Sometimes you end up with this shape, and I think that with the block, there was that lump in the middle, wasn't there? Because I think the modulator, the TV modulator was there. It was higher than everything else that John moved into the centre. And we had different modulators. There was a US version and a UK version. And one was higher than the other, and the whole was in a different place, and it was big lump in the middle. But you put the, I don't know, it's like hanging a picture on the wall. But the irregular aspects, you take that wall, for example, you've got this triangle of stairs going up. So you could measure the middle, put it there, it wouldn't look like the middle, that sort of compositional thing the brain does. So you could put Sinclair ZX80 on that block and think, wow, that was crap. Okay, let me put it somewhere else. No, that was crap. So it's over here. But now I need something on this block. What about that? Maybe some lines. I would guess that's how it happened. But yeah, I'll ask him if I ever see that.
Okay, up there, please.
Hey, I guess I've got a kind of a ULA question.
Wait, yes.
Just about
ULA. uncommitted logic array, actually it was committed by the time we got to it, that's the custom chip. The bit that made it possible to do a whole computer on a board that size rather than about half of the video circuit, which would have been the case in the previous machines, apart from the ones made by some of the biggest vertically integrated American computers. So, they were not made by Sinclair. Chris is going to tell us a bit about them, hopefully. Question?
So I can kind of wrap my head around, so memory layout for video memory seems quite interesting. I can more or less wrap my head around the reasons why. So people who don't know, there's the physical layout in memory is quite different from the way it physically appears on the screen. The order in which memory is.
It's not linear, it's in thirds.
It's very non-linear. So I can kind of wrap my head around why there are 8 blocks. Blocks of 8.
Well, the way that it works is that you've got each scan line is stored in memory, and then after that you get a scan line 8 pixels lower down, and then after that you get another one 8 pixels lower down, and then after you've done 8 groups, you then move back up and then do the second one and the 9th one. And then, when you get to the bottom of that, you keep going and you do the third one. And then when you've done 64 lines, you then start again. We start to work in thirds, and you come in at line 65, counting from 1, sorry, and carry on that way. It saves wire, but there's more to it than that.
Maybe until your explanation right there, which things tell you to put together, is why the free, why it comes in 3 chunks vertically on the screen. So you get a chunk of memory that's sort of raised to the top third of the screen, the chunk of memory makes the second third. Now for programmers it seems like it would be really nice if this was really.
Yeah, okay. Well, there's 2 sides to the design, really. One design decision in that respect was done for programming ease, what do you think otherwise at first glance? And the second reason, well, actually the first reason was to do with, again, cost. And the second reason, it's like the way it is to give something back to the program. And I'll explain very briefly. I'll keep the technical stuff sort of out of it as much as I can, but we are talking about memory access, so mileage will vary, I think. Basically, in order to, the CPU and the ULA have both got access to a shared bit of 16K memory. So the stock machine is just that one section. It's
a bit in the corner.
Now, those of you who use the ZX80 will know that every time you press a key, the screen flickers. And the reason for that is there was no ULA in the ZX80. It was all done through creative use of the interrupt. So every time the electron beam got to the side of the screen, a non-multiple interrupt would fire, and the CPU would dive off into some wrong program and basically throw bits, translated to pixels, out of a port, which would send 1s or 0s or on and off signal to the television. While it was doing that, the CPU couldn't be doing anything on the program. When you press a key on ZX80, obviously it needs to decide what key you press and take the appropriate action, so it has to do that and not display the screen. So you've got 2 design decisions if you've got what we call contention for a single resource, in this case it's memory, between, say, a video circuit and the processor, which is only one can access the memory at a time. So do you allow the CPU to have access, which is what they do in the ZX80? Do you stop the CPU and let the sort of hardware have access for doing the display, which is what they do in the Spectrum? And the ZX81 was kind of an in-between sort of thing, because in the ZX81, the CPU was still responsible for doing the screen. They just designed it, it was Jim Westwood, yeah, Jim, and designed a circuit which kind of like moderated that sort of interrupt access, so that it did stop the CPU, but in a way that from your program executing, it was still doing the screen, so it managed to avoid the flicker. But in the Spectrum, the decision was made to, we've got this custom video circuit now inside the ULA, so let's give it priority over the video memory at all times. Now, the result of that is that, and because it's using shared memory, if you've only got 16K spectrum and the ULA is taking control of the memory when it's doing the screen, you could leave, and the resolution is much higher and it's colour, it's far much more data being extracted from the memory. You're not going to really give. You need to give some time for the CPU to do something, otherwise you're going to have a very, very, very slow and responsive computer, being a single 16K model. So, where will we so far? Imagine the memory as being like a chessboard. So you've got columns and rows. So to access any, like playing battleships, to target any particular square on that chessboard, you can choose a column, and then a row, and then a column, whichever way around you want to do it. So what the burst read mode does is say, right, well, you choose which row you want, and then what you can do is read any values out of that row in quick succession without having to give the row address a second time. So what Richard needed to do was to arrange the memory such that it could read the pixel byte and then the colour byte from the same row in memory, even though they were physically separated out. Okay? So he had to organise the memory arrangement and choose the correct address lines to go into the row address, and he kind of muddled them up. Now, the consequence of muddling those up. Now, don't forget that the video is 256 pixels across by 192 lines down. So that is, you divide 256 by 8, it's 32. There's 32 bytes, and each one's 8 pixels, by 192 pixels high, and each one of those is in bytes on itself. The colour memory is 8 times less resolution. It's still 32 across, but it's only 24 times. It's a factor less. So each of those first 8 rows of that first column, basically, as you look at it on the screen, need to access the same memory location. So whatever address gets you to, whatever row address would get you to those first 8 lines, that first character square, while as you're looking at it this slide, they all need to map to the same row address, or one row address and the same one for the colour. So he had to juggle around the bits, basically, between a row and the address lines for a row and a column. Now, that's why you end up with that kind of muddly sort of behaviour. But he had some play that he could have with the other bits that were left over. He could put them there, or there, basically in the column address for the vertical bit, which steps through the eight lines. Now, he could have chosen it such that, now, don't quote me on this, I've documented it, you can look at that, but you could have had 124 byte increments step down 8 pixels. So don't forget, the ROM's only really interested in displaying characters. Yes, there's routines in it to do pixel lines, etc., but characters were the main thing. So he wants it very easy to step from any modulus of 8 going down the screen, so 0, 8, 16, etc. He wants to be able to step within that down so he can draw a character very, very quickly. So what's the easiest thing to do? Do we want a 1024 increment? Do we want a 512 increment? These are all powers of 2. Or do we want a 256 increment? That's really useful, 256 increment, because that, if you've got a 16-bit address, which you have, you're just incrementing the high byte, just with 1 inc. So that's why I say there's two reasons why it's as it is. It's as it is so you can do burst mode read, so you can get that data out very, very quickly, and then at least give 2 cycles out of 8 back to the CPU. But it's 256 down because they had a choice and they chose that one because it actually made it easier for programming.
Yeah, you do an increment H, which is only 4 cycles, yeah, rather than increment HL.
Well, you wouldn't have been able to do increment HL, you would have had to do an addition. Yeah, it's very complicated. So that's why. That's probably the least technical I can make it. But
to make this point about the contention on the video memory, it was actually quite innovative and more complicated to read the video memory as a priority, because other computers that were made at the time that this was being designed had what was called snow of various kinds. For instance, the Acorn Atom, the more that processor was accessing video memory, the more white spots would appear. So if you were playing a game of Space Invaders, it was played on a kind of wintry backdrop. The original IBM PC display adapter, again, the more you were writing to the screen, the more flex you would get, except in that case they'd assumed that the background colour was probably going to be black, and so you've got black stripes, and the same thing happened on the TRS-80 and the Video Genie. So we'd already reached a point where some difficult things were being done in an attempt to try and give you a picture which you might have taken for granted if you didn't realise how hard it was going to be. Thanks for the question. We've had one left. You, please.
Is there any one thing, without compromising what we ended up with, that could, at the time, have been done better for the same price?
With the benefit of hindsight. Okay, if you have that many gates yourself, Chris, in another 20 years or so?
Well, the 5000 series ULA was, I suppose it was a decade to do an industrial one.
Wrong one.
The 5000 series ULA was full. There wasn't any space in that at all. When we upgraded to the 6000 series, which was designed specifically for Sinclair using some, because the Sinclair's turnaround of these machines was no, it's not the same one yet. It was such a so high that Franti could take in their newer Fab 2 processors, and which resulted in a chip which actually had far lower power consumption and heat output, and fabricate a ULA that was almost like the 5000 series. And that was important because so much effort had gone into doing the all the routing design for the ULA that the cost of actually upgrading to a lower power consumption ULA, which had a complete different architecture, would have been cost prohibitive. So they kept it very, very similar. Like I said, it was done specifically for them. And so that had a big stack of gates around the outside that you could use, but probably about only 100 gates. And that's nothing. So even when they upgraded the ULA, they couldn't really do anything. And they had exactly the same challenges when they did the 128K. So in answering your question, you can look at the 128 and say, well, yes, they could have done some of the things they've done in the Timex machine, and think that was probably a mistake because they would already been proven. Timex have done the Timex machine over the States, and they've done it in video mirrors, and there's no reason why they could have adopted that into that. So in the 128K, that's where I'd say, in hindsight, it could have been done better. But in the existing spec, it was so innovative. There were so many really inspired electronic design decisions that were made that were kind of like, I look at it and think, well, that's so obvious. But that's because there's no precedent for stuff. At the time, it wasn't obvious, and what Simon was saying about the contention thing, it wasn't an obvious way of doing it. It was easier in the 6502, the Commodore, the BBC, etc., because the 6502 has got a very, very regular CPU cycle, very instructions, almost all exactly the same. So it's like grabbing stuff out of the memory, doing something with it, and that happens at a completely regular time. And because of that, they can do the video access at that moment, and you don't get any corruption of the screen because the two of them basically interlace without getting each other's way. With something like the Z80, which is a programming chip in some respects, but its instructions can go from 4 cycles to 21 or more. So I think, no, with the original Spectrum, it's brilliant to see this. And I don't think you could have changed it because it was cutting edge on so many levels.
But the other issue, you've got two other issues actually. One of them is that if you change the design of something like this, you do run the risk that you break it. And it's kind of a miracle when it works. And that does make you rather risk averse, especially when you've got a backlog of customers. And the other one is software, which is that if you make a change, it's very hard to be sure that all of the programs out there are not going to change their behaviour in a way that was not anticipated. And indeed, we saw some of those issues just in the very small changes between the issue 5 and the 6, in things like the interaction with joystick ports and the way that reading the keyboard when the issue 3 Spectrum came out became subtly different. Programs that used to work because of a small improvement from a design point of view to the ULA suddenly stopped behaving in the same way.
Well, I've got something to add actually. There is one thing that should have been done differently, which was the there's one I/O port on the Spectrum which handles it's output for the keyboard and the speaker and the mic socket, and it's input for the keyboard and the ear socket, which is port 254 FE. And it decodes that just by looking for the CPU, accessing, just saying, oh, I'm doing I/O, and it just looks for the A0, the first address line being low, and it just responds to that. Now, inside the ULA, there's plenty of space to be able to decode it all 7, or maybe not all 16, but certainly all 7, because the ULA's got a limited number of address lines coming to it. That was done in the ZX80, and it was done in the ZX81, and Richard saw no reason why it was effective. Why not carry that forward into the ZX Spectrum? In hindsight, I would say, that was probably a daft thing to do. We were talking about this earlier with regards to the edge connector. Nobody knew what people were going to use, were going to be plugging into this thing. And so that wouldn't have occurred to anybody. And said, well, nobody complained on the ZX8 or ZX81, let's just go with it. But we've been having recently some forum discussions about trying to, because of the incomplete decoding of the ports, you get one bit of software just right at the same A0 low, writes to about 15 different peripherals. So if you've got incompatibility there between products you're plugging in, well, I can't plug this and I can't plug this in together because they overlap in address space, and it's just a nightmare. So full decoding of the I/O ports. There's only one of them on the Spectrum. Should have been done, but how was anyone to know at that time?
The consequence was that we went from a situation where in theory it should have been possible easily to have 255 different things that could be plugged into there without clashing with one another, down to a situation where you could only get away with 7 or 8.
Yes.
And indeed Sinclair did just the same thing in the interface 1, with the consequence that you then lost another couple, I think, to the microdrives and the network. But it worked. It was simple. It was kind of demonstrably correct. And, well, they made a few million of it. Absolutely. Yeah, sure. Next question up there, please.
Also a question about ULA. In your book you wrote some tables with the voltages at the outputs of ULA and the analog outputs.
Yes.
For Y, V, and U video signals.
Yes.
Are there differences in the different ULAs, and are there differences between the items?
From memory, I think they are slightly different. I can't remember in the book what I think I modeled them on the 6000 series schematics, etc. Though the 5000 series schematics are, because I only reverse engineered the 6000 chip, it was the one that I had. De-encapsulated and then photographed on my script. So the ratios of the voltages are exactly the same. I'm not entirely sure, because I can't completely answer your question for certainty. But the resistor values are exactly the same proportions. Because the one thing that Frantic did in going from the 5000 to 6000 series ULA was to maintain the resistor ratios, which is what it basically comes down to, because using different ratios to give different voltages. Because they wanted to be able to make the chip a plug-in replacement. Now, if you were to plug in a new chip which has slightly different voltages, that would throw the video circuitry off. I've got a feeling if they're not identical, then within 0.0 something of a volt different. But a lot of the voltages that are in there, they've all been calculated in splice models, etc. to calculate them. They're really hard to sort of measure without ripping all the video circuitry out. But then the voltages kind of change because you need the load on them, and the load is reactive, so it's quite complicated to measure them to be sure. So it was far easier having circuit diagrams and guessing what the parameters of the transistors were to do it in splice and simulate them and stuff. And Richard kind of peer reviewed the values. Well, the circuit and my analysis of it, because it's probably, for me, it was the most complicated bit to do because it was purely analog.
Yeah, so it's a digital chip, but it's being used to do an analog job. And again, that's something that wasn't really anticipated until Sinclair came along and said, we need one solution.
Certainly not with that ULA. I mean, Frantic had hybrid digital and analog chips, but not that was.
This wasn't one of them. This was one of the cheap ones.
But it was all, again, it was a good cost choice. So.
Yeah, okay. Next question up there, please.
Sort of an industrial design question. The original Spectrum with this keyboard. So we talked about the look of it and the cost considerations. Something that someone's going to have their fingers on as the main interaction. I mean, that is their interaction with the machine. Lots and lots of tactile stuff. What sort of considerations went into, well, the materials, the feel of the thing?
Fewer than you'd imagine. The only way you could get a keyboard down to that sort of cost, which is simply by removing parts and using materials that, so for example, rubber sets or a lot of components. There's only silicon can do that. If you want to go down that route, you just stuff it. I mean, for me, just going back to your question, if I may momentarily, there were fantastically clever things that went on throughout any Sinclair product. Yet at the same time, there was some real yes, there were bad decisions. But having said that, they were generally driven on cost, and often you simply take a risk, a chance, and you're going to be lucky or unlucky. For example, classic is the edge connector. Again, we're talking about so just wants to go and flash the edge connector, and all the ZX80, 81, and even Spectrum. Lots of connections probably would have gone away instantly.
Rampack wobble.
Rampack wobble. That was the phrase. So, for a few cents or pence whoever's making it, that would not be a massive problem that plagues many people. And then, Rick, your two questions together actually is, I would have liked to have had more budget at my disposal, but it just didn't work that way to have done the keys differently. They may well have had, mobile phones, modern keyboards of today do use elements of that fundamental technology where it's silicon and it collapses. Sometimes there's tactile feedback built into it, sometimes they're not, but fundamentally that drove a lot of your keyboards today.
Remote controls particularly.
Yes, indeed. And you get a massive advantage, and sadly, with life, there are always disadvantages, and one of them could be what you're talking about. This is the this is the data input area. So, for example, I would have loved to take that technology and actually put hard plastic keys in. That would have given us more control over texture, surfaces, colours, and it would have been quite an interesting problem. However, this is the funny thing. To me, in some ways, it's a weird-looking product, and by today's standards. And a lot of people like it. If you then went back and beautified it, people might not like it. Maybe it's the idiosyncrasies that people like, things that you might think are ugly.
So, did you see a Climax?
I was going to ask about that.
Yeah. I remember. Whoever was doing my job, whoever client employed, the fact is he had a product design. He'd gone through design education, all the rest, production engineering, bits and bobs, and none of these companies, when you judge the results, everything from the Americans, you just can't imagine they had a product designer on board. It was just an engineering department that had done it. And that's what you get. And the Timex was just like that.
They have a space bar.
They have the plastic key.
Yeah. But they just don't go at it with this holistic approach. I'm going to consider everything in every decision I make. It's all broken up in departments, and then you end up with a committee decisions, which could never, ever be as good. No chance. You need a single mind for everything that controls it.
Was that your mind or Clive's mind?
Well, I don't know. He's at the top, but I did stuff, and he said, good. And off we went. So, for example, he was really concerned, so was I, about the aesthetic of Japanese products coming in. They look like they've been made in a Swiss watch factory. They were fantastic. They were pressed metal, incredibly precise surfaces. We that wasn't open to us. Those industries didn't exist in this country, and we tried, but it just wasn't going to happen. Japan was on the up, and Britain with its 300-year empire and naval history was on the way down. There's only so much you can do, so you've got to work with what you've got.
Do you feel, what are the restraints for the plus keyboards, budgetary and what are the ethics behind it, and do you feel that it achieved the same kind of minimalism?
Yeah, good question. You could go around the room and ask people what they want in a product. The product hasn't been designed yet. And you take on board everything they want to produce the product, no one likes it. Okay. So the keyboard always came in for criticism, not that we were ever bothered, because to rectify those criticisms, you had a product that would have been too expensive. So the Plus products really harked back to the QL. So sadly for me, we were never able to do a silent spectrum, okay? Because by then we'd done flat screen TV, we'd done micro drives, interface, all sorts, and we were then into the QL, which was a really dangerous territory for that kind of company to go into, from this kind of product to a business machine. The whole company culture would have to change, especially our view on returns question over there. The QL just wasn't going to happen. It was uncritical that it did. There just must have been Sinclair magic. But the point of mentioning QL was that we knew we needed a proper professional keyboard, and the most appropriate technology at the time, despite the cost, was two-shot injection molding. So you're not printing the legends or the graphics on the keys. It's actually injection molded in. So you have these really complex mold tools that squirt the white legend first, and then it opens, rotates, a new cavity comes in, then you squirt the black in. And this was all done in Sweden. It's the only company in the world that we could find that did two-shot filling, 4 keys. And so, for example, they were making remote controllers for people like Philips, where they were using 5-shot. So it created quite a, so you had a proper keyboard, with quite a strong corporate identity that really did start pushing the company forward. So if you stood back and thought, right, we're going to do another version of the Spectrum, and then another, and then another, what are we going to base it on? Are we going to just, actually, I remember the decision. We were talking about really important decisions and how they can be done in such an unimportant way. Yes. And this decision, I hadn't thought about until now. It was almost, I think it was a meeting with pilots or something like that. It was, what aesthetic are we going to follow? How is it going to look? What is the face of the next Spectrum Plus and all the rest? And I think it was just, I don't know, how much time we have. How much time to do it? I know we need a proper keyboard. Well, we've got one on QL, let's use that. We spent 150 grand in old pounds, tooling it up or whatever it was. And so we'll go with that. So as soon as you go with that in its shape, this game's set and match, doesn't it? How can it not look like a QL? Because you've got this keyboard block. The keyboard is the size of the product. That's it. That's how it would look. So really, the shape of the form and the aesthetic, if you like, of all the pluses are just an extrapolation of the QL corporate feel and that keyboard. Which actually, I think is a shame. I'd like to go back and do the house Spectrum.
And on the inside, it was that same board.
Yeah. With the stupid feet on to tilt it up.
It's not as stupid as the QL feet, though. Yeah. They just fell off. Next question there, please.
Yeah, a little question on the industrial design. Of all the sort of Sinclair products, which were you most satisfied with? Which do you look back on and go, that really, really worked?
You're not going to like the answer. Probably the ZX84, because possibly there were a lot of clever things about it. I don't mean it does from a design standpoint, but it was quite something. But again, it was a natural evolution of the ZX80, so the ZX80 was probably the clever one in some ways. But again, you've got to lay down criteria for judging something, and it was the first thing they ever did. Did what I wanted to do. appeal and all the rest of it. Something not quite there with the keys, and I don't know what it was, because I tell you, I've put some time into messing around with keys prototypes, but I don't know, maybe it's meant to be that way.
Is there anything you would revisit? I think talking about sort of fixing your relay. Is there anything?
Just the keys. Just the keys. And again, harking back to something I use again, you've got, because they're evolved products, and you do get stuck with a legacy, and it's very difficult to decide, are we going to drive on the right-hand side of the road, or are we going to carry on the left-hand side of the road? You have this argument, no one knows what this is, because it's so hideous to make, you don't make it. So you have the legacy, and you've got to carry a lot of it. Occasionally you get the moments where you can drop it and go with something new. But, ZX80, we didn't know what we're going to connect to this thing. Might need a printer, but whose is it going to be? We're going to make one, how do you do it? So, it's only as time goes by that people start wanting to put this on or that on, because there's, the market is really deciding how the product's going to be. You get responses, reactions, so you try and address those with a bit of hardware and software and all the rest of it. So, hideously lacking on expandability, but how do you know what you need?
Afraid we're running out of time, and luckily, Rick and Chris will still be around, I think, for a little while after this, so you might be able to get an exclusive a bit later. But we've got a couple more hands that are still there. Hopefully, a hardware one and a design one. Is your hardware or?
Yeah.
Okay, we'll go for hardware one first, and we'll come back to you then later, if that's all right.
One thing I noticed on a lot of the American computers were going for 2040 80 color text. Now, what I found when I opened an entire XT and put that on the telly, 320 pixels doesn't line up very well with the phospher dots, whereas 256 pixels wide seems spot on for a cathode ray TV. Was that deliberate, or is it standard, or is it on the line?
I think the Americans were doing it technically right, if you don't mind me wading in on this, because there are 160 colour clocks across a Power NTSC display. So from that point of view, accepting that the border is a big variable in this respect, I think they were actually trying to align the colour correctly with the capability of the display to come up with a colour transition. This is honestly not something that Sinclair paid very much attention to. And when I was working at Central TV on this thing, which is one of the first times in 1983 when we were trying to get full screen home computers on broadcast television, we needed many tens of thousands of pounds worth of equipment in order to get a broadcast quality signal out of there.
There's one way plus some more that comes to 160, whereas
that's right.
The 80 color will work full screen, but when you put a border around it, the 80 color stuff looks rubbish.
Yeah, right. The Spectrum, the ZX80 was doing everything software. And they were only using the Z88 CPU, so they went up to the speed they could run that at. So that kind of dictated the horizontal resolution you can get out of it, basically. Which was, the ZX81 is ZX80, or whatever, it's exactly the same thing, really. But then as soon as you get into Spectrum, it's exactly the same. They just carried on, they wanted to use the same TV display and all that kind of stuff. They just didn't change it, so it was a product of function, really, harking back to ZX80. So, no mind. In fact, Richard and Jim was there, who knew a lot about television anyway, but Richard didn't realise that if you don't synchronise the chroma clock with the pixel clock, you get dot crawl. We all know about the dot crawl. So that was addressed in the 128K spectrum, which is why the CPU speed is slightly different. So they can divide it down to 8.8 megabits and down again to get the color clock, so they're somewhat alike. But no, there's no thought whatsoever was given to it's just analog. They actually scan the screen and do it. And different TVs would have had different dot pitch. I use that term, it's not really relevant for analog TVs, but anyway. So pick one TV, Grundig and actually would be different. So.
And again, if you think of some of the other computers out at the time, they had problems which Sinclair managed to solve. In particular, BBC Micro is pretty hard to see all of those 160, 240, 220 or whatever, because they tend to be drawn off the edge of the screen, vertically and horizontally. So the decision was made to make sure, I believe, that it would work with everybody's telly, even accepting the fact that it might not fill anybody's. Yeah, sure. Last question.
It's a question around the product name. I mean, it's a brilliant product name. Is there a story? It's quite a big question, but is there a story behind it? Did somebody just decide at the beginning, hey, it's a Spectrum and that was it? Was it marketed? How did you research?
I should imagine there's a story behind most of these names. I remember in the calculator days, although I was working with a company then, one of the calculators was named Sovereign, and it made out of metal press parts. It looked fantastic. The sovereign was so cool. Scientific it was the way this thing looked. But they ran a competition. They had a production line of about 10, 50 people, and one of the production line girls came up with this name Sovereign. So subsequently we used to try and run competitions. So you always had these sort of development names like the ZX82 or whatever. You had to call it something so people knew what you were talking about. So you just called it more way or B. But I don't know who thought of it. Clive, someone will know because the person who thought of it will know. But I think I agree. I think you picked up. The really important thing to, certainly from a marketing standpoint and the market out there, fundamentally we've gone from monochrome to colour, and Spectrum just signed it all. This wasn't meant to be a permanent thing. We just wanted to get a bit of colour there. It was meant to be a peel off. And so I'd like to spend much more kind of thing.
Richard told me an anecdote, and maybe this maybe you can clarify or not, that it was to be called the Sinclair Rainbow.
Oh, that's good.
Which is why when Richard left with Steve Dickers to do the computer, they set sort of rainbow computers. They used the name. And it was somebody's wife or girlfriend came up with the Spectrum, and that was it.
This sounds right, yeah, I know that. That's very familiar. Yeah.
It was going to be rainbow.
Yeah. Great, Chris, thank you very much indeed.